Like always, please don't just believe me. Don't just assume it's true because I say so. Search the scriptures because we're going hard and heavy. Here we go. OTO. Deuteronomy. Genesis took us into Egypt. You might know that. Exodus took us to Mount Sinai. Or Sinai. Leviticus added a month to Mount Sinai. Numbers really got us to the border and to the wilderness. That was where we left off. We got to the border. We blew it. We wandered around. First generation dies. Deuteronomy sits us before Moses, before he dies, and then he'll die. Little spoiler alert. Just like Romans that breaks up into 5 sections, sin, salvation, sanctification, sovereignty, and service, the book of Deuteronomy prepares us for being reinserted back into the world. Listen to that. God pulls you out. He delivers you out of bondage, pulls you out of bondage, redesigns your brain. That's the whole idea of getting us our Sinai experience. Reconstitutes us and then reinserts us back into a world that defies and denies him so that we can be, in essence, transformed and transformers, not like cars that become robots. So it's important to recognize that. He wants us to be revolutionized so that we can become revolutionaries. That's the point of it. But for that to happen, he pulls us aside, reconstitutes us, redesigns us, in essence, puts in a whole new operating system, and then gives us spiritual gifts like apps that we then are used to transform the world around us. That's the idea. By the way, for what it's worth, it is Jesus' go-to book when he is in the temptation. I believe it's 6:12, 6:8, 6:16, I believe, and then 8:3. All 3 times that he is slamming and body slamming the enemy, he is using Deuteronomy to do so. It's interesting that the terms that we'll find, by the way, keywords, judgments, and the way that we have it, notice they look like fractions there. The first is the amount of times it appears in the rest of the Torah, and the second number then would be the amount of times it appears is solely in the book of Deuteronomy. So obviously, if the second number is higher, what that would mean is there are more times it appears in the book of Deuteronomy than the rest of the Torah. Does that make sense? The word judgments, for what it's worth, appears 16 times in the rest of the Torah. In the book of Deuteronomy, it appears 20. The word for what it's worth for judgments is mishpot. Mishpot means, in essence, God's verdicts. Judgments. Statutes. The word is collectively used 18 times in the Torah, collectively used 29 times solely in the book of Deuteronomy. The word love is 8 times in the Torah, the rest of the Torah, 16 times in the book of Deuteronomy. I think that's why it was Jesus' favorite book. Of all the books he quotes, Deuteronomy is his go-to book. Because there is no book that focuses more on God loving you in the Old Testament, oddly enough, than the book of Deuteronomy. The word hear, Shema, used 22 times in the rest of the Torah, 32 times in the book of Deuteronomy. The word heart, almost dead even, 48 times in the rest of the Torah, 46 times in the book of Deuteronomy. But the term, the Lord your God, 44 times in the rest of the Torah, 240 in the book of Deuteronomy. God really wants you to have a relationship with the Lord. And I love it. It doesn't say the Lord God, the Lord your God. What makes, and please understand, for you to embrace being inserted into the world and being a world changer by first being changed, by your world being changed so you can be a world changer, the Lord can't just be the Lord God. He's clearly Lord. He's in charge. He's clearly God. He's the creator. But he has to be the Lord your God, or it really isn't going to work. The word commandment, for what it's worth, 198 times in the Torah, 4 times in the book of Deuteronomy. Commandments isn't the big issue, because we've already nailed that down because he's the Lord. But because he's the Lord your God, it's his judgments, his decisions. That's that mishput word. And the word hoch, and the word hoch, the word we get for statutes, is a word which means his appointments, the things he set into place. When you love someone, it's more than just a decision. A government, normally people don't fall in love with a government unless they want to be part of it. chances are we don't look in, because we have no relationship with the government more than normally something that seems like they take. Now, granted, the reason I say that is they can pass commandments. Those are just laws. And we understand, in essence, they're supposed to be in charge, and therefore the laws are important. But when you have a relationship with someone, the judgments that they make are fundamental. And the things that are important in their life become important to you. And that becomes the big difference between Deuteronomy, if you will, and Leviticus. Not that either one is more important than the other. They just both have to sit imperatively in our hearts. Now, with that in mind, the timestamp, for what it's worth. Year 40, month 11, day 1. In other words, we are in the last month of the 40th year. The next timestamp, for what it's worth, will be Joshua 4:19, and that's literally when they come up and cross the Jordan, when they're on the other side. And that'll be Joshua 4:19. Chapters 1 through 11, we are looking back to learn. Chapters 12 to 34, we are looking forward to warn. And this already blows the doors as I start to think about how this is. And it's simple in this sense. God wants us to review the life we've had with him. He doesn't review, by the way, he doesn't spend any time about how much it stunk in Egypt. Because he's not having us review life as miserable as it was before him. What he wants us to review is our life with him up to this point, because we're about to go to battle. The book of Joshua, that God willing we'll get to next week, is all battles. And then divvying up the spoils. He goes, if you're going to if you are going to go, and I remind you, it is a place of overflow and fruitfulness. It's going to be a battle to get there. And if you know it's going to be a battle to get there, let's review who we are and who he is up to this point. He will focus on 4 primary events up to this point, and then he'll point out a couple points of those in our time to point out some, if you will, in the simplest sense, character flaws. For what it's worth, and then look back at the overview, that's that side sheet. He'll talk about in Numbers 10:11 that we in faith left Mount Sinai. Then in chapter 14, how we blew it by not using our faith and saying we wouldn't go into the promised land. Chapter 21, God starts to show us his resume of slaying giants. He goes, remember in faith how we took down giants together. Granted, God did all the work. And then in chapter 25, but remember how without that faith, you fell and were almost destroyed. That was with the Moabite women, for what it's worth. So look at, in faith you left, but in lack of faith you didn't go in. In faith we took down giants, but without faith, you were almost destroyed. And what we'll learn is, faith will always lead to obedience when it comes to God. Is where without it, disobedience will always lead to idolatry. And that's just the thing God will not put up with. In our first section then, and you can see already why I'm kind of excited, and then he'll start talking about, we'll revisit the law, and then basically this is the overview of our first section. Again, we go through those 4 events, by faith, not by faith, by faith, not by faith. Then he goes, now let's look back at the law, chapters 5 and 6. And by the way, does anyone remember what the first commandment is?
Thou shalt not make any gods.
No other gods before my face. God goes, if we're going to get into this, and imagine if it will, it's like a man pursuing a woman is going, look at it, if we're going to get into this thing for real, and this is a pursuit to marriage, I just want you to know, on the table is this is a non-negotiable. I really want to be your only man. Because I really don't want to marry you and have you run around with a bunch of other people, because I'm not really getting a good end of the deal this way. By the way, I'll do the same. That's the first commandment. And he reviews all of this and he goes, now let's boil that down to 1, chapter 6. Could you just love me? Love me with everything. And what we'll find is love will be interlaced in all of this. So, in light of all of that, hey. So look at, by faith, not by faith, by faith, not by faith. Let's revisit the law. Let's get back to the law in regards to what is it? It's about loving. And then we'll talk about intermarriage in light of that. Remember, the intermarriage was the idea of marrying somebody, chasing after someone, giving someone your heart that doesn't have the same God as you. You know where that's going to go. Chapter 9, he'll talk about the serpent and the cow in light of the commandment. Obviously, neither of those are right. So therefore, why don't you just love him and you won't have to worry about it? And that's a choice. That's our first 11 chapters. So let's look at it a little bit closer. Nestled in the middle of that again, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, known as the Shema. We'll talk about that in a moment. Chapter 1. At Mount Horeb, we appointed leaders. We went to Kadesh Barnea, and remember, they sent spies. The people's response, verse 27, said, because the Lord hates us, he's brought us into the land to destroy us. Verse 30, Moses said, the Lord our God goes before you. He'll fight for you. Verse 32, yet you wouldn't believe the Lord your God, and therefore you wouldn't go in. And because you didn't have that faith, only 2 people that had that faith will go in. There is a good news in all of that. And the good news is that if you had faith even though nobody else did, you will not be punished for everyone else's lack. Isn't that good news? Imagine, you ever have times, and I'll be honest, we fall in love with Jesus and we challenge to embrace his word in its entirety, to follow him with all of our guts and to love him with all of our guts. And then we get into a general mass of people, and this is not judging the rest of the world, but sometimes you're like, oh, you guys are Christians too. And they're not excited about Jesus. You ever get in those circles and you're like, what am I missing? Because I would tend to think that most people, or all people who call themselves Christians, should be in this place. No, that doesn't mean they have to be a spaz like me. But I would still like to think that when you bring up the name Jesus, it should at least evoke a smile. If not a woo-hoo in whatever way you woo-hoo. And you realize God's look at, but Caleb, and by the way, it is a little bit disturbing because God does say that before Moses falls. And he's the only 2 that are going to the promised land are Joshua and Caleb. And if I were Moses, I'd be and? Interesting, we do know Joshua's going to take over. And it's interesting because throughout this book, we are going to find that he's already timid. But listen to this. Follow me on this stream of thought for a second. They were at Mount Sinai. God met them there. Right? Then they leave Mount Sinai and they ultimately go up to another mountain, if you will. That mount, for what it's worth, is Mount Seir. And that is basically where their topography is for their failure. Y'all with me on that? So they're like, heck no, we won't go. And off they go back. And listen what it says in chapter 2. They returned by way of the Red Sea and skirted Mount Seir. Now, I do like this. When you had a place of falling face down, flat, there's a failure of faith. Is that a fair term for this? Do you know what he does? He brings you back to the place of deliverance. For them, that was the Red Sea. Let me ask you, if you think with your heart for a second here, what would have been the most transforming part of the Red Sea crossing to you? With the history of being a slave for over 400 years in Egypt, being beat, run down, dominated by Egypt, would it have been walking through the Red Sea? Let's be honest, that would be way cool. That would be something to tell the grandkids and the great-grandkids, no doubt. That is one thing. But I'll at least say this. For me, it would be watching all of Pharaoh's army drown in front of you. Because this was the sum and total of the enemy in front of you. It's one thing for them, think about it, God could have actually had them not cross, he could have closed the sea, and what would have happened is you would say, well, as long as they can't cross the Red Sea, we're cool. But they would always still be there. And there'd still be that thought in your life that there's a limitation to your freedom, and the limitation's the Red Sea. You go past that Red Sea, you're a dead man, because Egypt still exists. But to see the entire army drown in front of you says this is over. Wouldn't it be great to just see the enemy and all of the demons drown in the blood of Christ in front of you? And then you do something that's infinitely smaller than that, and you fall on your face and you fail in your faith. God says, let's go back to that place of deliverance. Let's go back to the cross and the grave. Does that make sense? And then he walks you around Mount Seir. And what is Mount Seir? It was the place of failure. He goes, let's revisit this, the greatest victory. Now let's take another look at this from all angles. Is there any angle of this that stands a chance when this has already happened? Do you see the grace of God in chapter 2? And that's the way that Moses is telling the story. Now, then he starts to point out his resume for giant slaying. Listen to this. The Edomites conquered the incumbent Emim. Remember those days? Probably not. The Ammonites, not to be confused with the Amorites, the Ammonites conquered the incumbent, and one of my favorite names, Zanzumim. I don't know what they'd be like, but they just sound like fun people. But apparently they were giants as well. All the regions of Agab and Bashan. Bashan should sound familiar. That was one of those two great kings conquered. That whole area was originally called the land of the giants. Interesting. What it appears the case is that even Mount Seir was formerly Horite territory, and the Kaphtorim, whom we might call today the Philistines, or the Palestinians, well, we won't get into the politics of that, took down the Avim. Here's the point. In every one of those cases, before Israel ever showed up in that area, other giants had been conquered by other people that God gave them the land to, which tells me, even before you, he was already slaying giants. And apparently, we're not the only people God slays giants for. He's like, let me show you how I took down other people. Now, we have this beautiful benefit as Christians. We can look to the scriptures and see how God did that to a people before us, if you will. To be honest, still doing it. But we can look and go, I know how to take giants. Check out my resume. God, 1 million giants, zip. Ain't no giant stood up. And I love this because when he gets this, he goes, let's review this for a point. Before the battles before us, and I remind you, this is all preparing us. Let's look at our past to learn from it, because we have battles to face that are those battles are going to take us forward into a place we've never been before. A place of overflow and a place of abject fruitfulness. But if you're going to know battles have to be fought to get that way, well, then you better get this through your head first. There is no giant in front of you that I have not taken up bigger before. And if I've taken down every giant before me before this place, you will not be the first failure in this. You'll just be another person walking in the shadow of the giant slayer. And what I love is God never limits or diminues. He never ignores the giants, nor does he ever say that they're not giants. He openly will tell you that's what they were, but he just says they're no match for him. Then he points out about us, being Israel in this case. Now, I'm not telling you this church is Israel. I'm just putting us into the shoes of this. He says, remember Og from Bashan? 60 fortified cities that he had with him. And for what it's worth, this is what we know about Og, is the size of his bed. It was 9 by 4 cubits. Cubits are actually easy. They're easier here than they are in America. Because all a cubit is, in the simplest sense, is a half of a meter. So that's simple math. So here we go. 9 cubits is? Okay, yes. Simple math. Sorry. 4.5. Don't worry, no one heard you, Lois. No one heard you, ma'am, sir.
4.5.
4.5 meters by 4, which is 2 meters. That is a massive bed. For the Americans that might be listening, it's 13.5 feet by 6 feet. Because it's basically 2/3. And he goes, no, look at it. Let's be reminded of this. Giants have fallen. You've already watched giants fall. So before we go any farther, at the risk of time, stop for a moment. Take your pen in your hand. Ask the Lord to bring to your remembrance 3 giants he's already slain in your life. Write them down. Do yourself a favor. Is there anything that had the word hopeless attached to it? Wouldn't it be great? You can, by the way, let that be the starter. I'm not in any way dissing anyone who has anniversaries for horrible events in their life. There are certain cultures, that's paramount to the culture. But can I challenge, regardless of what culture you have come from, that Christ culture would encourage us to start celebrating the anniversary of giant slaying? Now, if I were to ask, tell me 3 horribly tragic events in your life, would you be able to come up with those quicker? Isn't it amazing how we are wired to remember those moments? When she said, I just want to be friends. Sorry, Shemai. You know. When you went alone to prom. Sorry, Jaden. That was, sorry guys. That was harsh. Yeah, that's not the point. And by the way, that's all made up. I really have no inside information. The point is this. God never told us we need to take an inventory of those things. I'm not telling you can't. But what I'm telling you is, don't you think it's tragic, though, that we can't recall some moments that at that moment we swore we'd never forget because of how profound that deliverance was? It's about time to be honest. If we were going to be honest with ourselves, the more you walk with Christ, you realize the more holidays you get. And every day becomes a day of celebration. Remember on this day, this event. Why not? Now, couldn't that make us a more joyful, victorious Christian? Can you see why the enemy would work so hard for you to remember your defeats more than God's victories? But that doesn't mean God's going to avoid your defeats either, because they teach us a lesson. Chapter 4. Now that you've seen all the giants fall, you downed giants, but you fell by girls. Now, not to diss girls here, but with all due respect, I don't think that the girls of the Moabites, the girls of Moab, were bigger than the giants they fought. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Baal Peor. This is from Numbers 25. How the Lord your God has destroyed from among you all the men who followed Baal of Peor. But you have held fast to the Lord your God and are alive today. Aren't you glad as well that God doesn't destroy people that aren't guilty among a nation of guilty people? And the wandering will always lead to your defeat. And here's the point. Disobedience always leads to idolatry. Because let's face it, the reason we're disobeying is we are convinced something else is a better payoff than what God can offer us in our obedience. Doesn't that sound like idolatry from the get-go? It does to me. And again, Baal Peor was the place where the people, it should have been fell, not feel, although anyways, with the women of Moab. And this is what he says. For what great nation is there that has God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? For whatever reason we may call upon him. And what great nation is there that has such statutes and righteous judgments as are in this law which I set before you today? So he goes, listen, take heed. Be careful. Be warned. Especially to the words God spoke on the mountain when you heard but you didn't see. Don't make idols. And don't make an idol of anything tangible. For the Lord your God is a consuming, jealous fire. And in the simplest sense, what he says is, in verse 29, but from there, after their fall, he says, look at, though I'm telling you this is what you shouldn't do, I still know you're going to do it. But when you do and life really gets awful, from there you will seek the Lord your God, and you will find him when you seek him with all your heart and with all your soul. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers, which he swore to them. Because he's a jealous God, he will deal with your infidelity. But because he's a merciful God, he will be found if you fully seek him, and he will restore you. There's no other God like that. It was Oprah who said she couldn't worship the God of the Bible because he's a jealous God, and she would not want to serve a God that gets jealous. She has no idea what jealousy she's talking about. you learn you'll never be jealous of something you don't want. You win a lifetime subscription to Starbucks, good on you. I'm not a coffee drinker. You win a lifetime, pass to the rodeo tractor pull country hee-haw off, the yeehaw palooza. I am not going to be jealous because it's nothing I want. I'm not calling either of those sinful. I just don't like them. But you're only jealous of what you want. And the only thing God wants is you. To be honest, if God wasn't jealous when we turned away from him, I'd be more concerned. Now, this new life is not iconized in the simplest sense by our constantly still shopping gods. So let's review God's standard. Chapter 5, he reviews the 10 Commandments. And I have to say something here, a side note, but an important one. Because there is a verse that is pulled out of context and becomes its own bizarre doctrine. And it comes from this. Verse 9, God says, "You shall not bow down to those idols or those false gods or serve them. For the Lord your God is a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands to those that love me and keep my commandments." The doctrine that is birthed from this becomes a doctrine that is called the doctrine of generational curse. Perhaps you've heard of it. And the idea is someone did something, and as a result of that, the children and the grandchildren have to suffer and pray away or call in a deliverance or a guy that can wave incense to deliver you from the generational curse. And they'll say, it's right here in the book of Deuteronomy. Well, listen to this verse again. Visiting the sin or the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation of those that hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. God's not saying, look at, if your grandpa was a witch or a warlock, you're going to have to suffer. But now, granted, if your grandfather was a sleaze and he picked up some kind of horrible disease from it, it's fairly likely you may hand it down. But I wouldn't call that a generational curse. I would call that biology. But if you hate him, you just might have to inherit the deal. But if you love him, you encounter his mercy. And nobody seems to focus on the second part. He's like, look, there may be a generation or two that's going to happen as a result of somebody and their adultery, but there are thousands who experience my mercy. Do you see the difference here? The idea is there is payback to your disobedience, and your families will be affected by it. But there are thousands on the other side of that would experience my mercy. So you go, well, I'm fearful I have a generational curse. My challenge to you is then stop hating God. Case solved. And then he goes, let's make that into one. In chapter 6, he says this. And of course, this is the Shema. And the reason is, the Hebrew word for listen is Shema. Not Shamar. Shamar is guard. That comes from chapter 2 of Genesis. That means to guard. Shema means to listen. There's a difference between overhear and listen. This is a listening that a person does because the information is important and they want to build and live and act on it. And he says, Shema Israel. Hear, Israel. And then he says, the 4-letter word that we would call the tetragram, Yad He Vav He, that the Jehovah Witnesses say it's Jehovah, which is actually the poorest Hebrew rendering for it, but lots of people buy it anyways. Is it Yahweh? Is it Yahweh? To be honest, the Jews today, they went to the point where they were like, well, let's just say Adonai so we don't have to actually argue over it. And then it got even worse than that. They're like, let's just call it Vashem. What that means is, Hashem. What that means is the name. What name is it? The name. So did anyone say, Baruch Hashem? Like we'd say, praise the Lord. They'd say, Baruch Hashem. That means praise the name. So let's just say, for the sake of it, it's translated Lord, capital L-O-R-D in our Bibles, is God. It is the name of God. Shema Israel. Let's just use the word Yahweh, just for argument's sake. Yahweh, Elechainu, Yahweh echad. Yahweh, God. Elechanu, God. Yahweh, God. Echad is one. Literally, the first thing that is in the Shema is this. Hear, listen, Israel. God, God, God is one. Think that one through for a moment. Not so rough for a Christian that believes in the Trinity, is it? God's like, think about this, because we're actually looking here, if you think about it, when this is over 1000 BC here. To be honest, it's roughly 1300, almost 1400 BC. And he's like, for that means for over 3,000 years, 3,500 years, God's like, listen, God, 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 we're just one. We're one. Isn't that beautiful? And then he says, look it. Once you get that, know this. Would you just love me with everything? And the Jews turn it into a trinity as well, your heart, soul, and strength. It's the Greeks that will add a fourth part, and we'll talk about that on another day. And then he says this. These words which I command you shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk in your way, when you lie down, when you rise up. In other words, he goes, wouldn't it be great if he's like, what do you think God means by this? God, God, God is one. How do I, in this particular moment, love God with my heart? Love him, my levav, my insides. How do I love him with my mind right now? How do I love him with my strength, with my vitality? When you lay in bed, you go, oh, God. God, 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 you're one. How do I love you more tomorrow? With all my heart, all my soul, my strength. You wake up, oh, God, how do I love you more today? When you get out of the house, well, I'm leaving the house. Now, how do I love God more in this world around me with all my heart, mind, soul? And then you get to work. How do I love God right now more with all my heart, soul, and strength? How do I do that now? You get back into your house. It's nighttime. How do I love you now, Lord, with all my heart, soul, and strength? Because wouldn't it be great if that was not but the topic on your heart from this point forward? What if that happened with us? Could you imagine? Even if what that meant was we meet up and I'm like, Nick, how do we love God more with our heart, soul, and strength? Let's just pray, God, show me how to love you more with my heart, soul, and strength. Tonight in your prayers, God, let me love you with my heart, soul, and strength. Tomorrow morning, days before you, God, how do I love you with my heart, soul, and strength? He goes, let me tell you what. Bind it like a sign on your hand, like frontlets between your eyes. Write them on the doorposts of your house and gates. Now, this is such a perfect example of God's heart and man's insanity. And I don't mean to be rude, and I don't mean to be uncool. I just mean to be honest. When God says, I want it to be like a sign on your hand, it would be like, tattoo that on the back of your hand so that every time you look at the back of your hand, you see this. Now, I'm not telling you to do that. I'm telling you the idea of is, every time you look, there's no part that's more familiar with us, or we wouldn't be using the phrase, I know it like the back of my hand. We don't say, I know it like my toenails, or I know it like my chin hair, or I know it like my falling hair, or I know it like my... It's like the one thing we use as the phrase for the thing that is most familiar is the back of our hand. God goes, yeah. Well, if that's the thing you see more than anything else, then every time you look at that, let it remind you that I want all of that. I get it. And that's this ring. It's the Shema. It is on the back of my hand. And every time I look at it, I'm like, Lord, well, I shouldn't say every time, but it is common to look and go, all right, Lord, how do I love you with my heart, soul, and strength? Let it be like the frontlet between your eyes. In other words, every time you close your eyes. What's a frontlet? Anyone know the frontlet? Your eyelids. Between your eyes. Let it be like every time you close your eyes, you would see it. You ever stare at something so long that when you close your eyes, you still see it? You get it. Let it be on your doorposts so that when you walk in and walk out, you actually see, hear this. Put your name there. Hear this, Bruno. God, God, God is one. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and strength. So what do we do as a result of that? Instead of seeing it, we roll it up, we take a scroll and we roll it up, and we put it in a black box you cannot see through. And they tie it on the back of their hands, and they tie it as this box on the front of their heads, and then they roll it up, and then they put it in a thing on the side of a door, and they'll go, and they'll kiss you. You ever see these things are called mezuzahs? These are called phylacteries, by the way. Here's the sad part. I love the fact someone's trying to do what's being said, except this. How can it possibly be reminding you when you can't even see what it says anymore? It's in a little black box. And there's the sadness of what can happen when we actually don't hear the heart. Mezuzahs and phylacteries came from them. Mezuzah is the thing on the door. And then God says this, listen, be careful. Because when you enter in, this life's going to be pretty ready-made. Vineyards you haven't planted. Basically, the whole thing's going to be ready-made. But when you do it, do not forget who got you there. Because it'll be easy to do when you get comfortable. Chapter 7, and I'll move a little quicker. The Lord gives you the 7 nations. I'm giving them to you, therefore don't intermarry. If I want you to drive them out, I definitely don't want you giving your heart to them. You're there to change them. The problem is, the moment you hand someone your heart, you give them the privilege of influence. And then it says this. The Lord loves you. Because he loves you and keeps his word. You know why he loves you? Because he loves you. You go, well, that doesn't seem to answer the question. Apparently it does to God. I'd say the Lord loves you because he's love. So here's the good news. You actually don't have to find an answer for why he loves you. Because if you think that the reason you love someone is because of something inherently in them, it's the wrong kind of love. Think that through. A selfless, surrendered love is a choice you make, regardless of the person. But if you're like, but if I want to be like attracted to them before I actually love them selflessly, we are already drawing something out of the deal. I want to make sure we have this beautiful, healthy interplay, intellectually, or, then when I see her, chocolate flows down streams and Vivaldi plays from the air and doves start to fly. Well, hey, I'm not telling you those things are bad. I'm just telling you when he talks about a selfless love, he's like, it's a choice. Talk to somebody in the Middle East. What you'll find is they're not like, wait, love first, then comes marriage. They're like, no, you make a choice, love follows. That's what they say. So I don't think it's like the Middle East until they've been influenced by us. We can thank us for that. Until then, nobody in the Middle East goes, I just want to know what you found in me that you loved me. God's like, I chose you when I love you. And they're like, okay, got it. But the point is, intermarriage, and again, intermarriage, what that means is marrying somebody who doesn't have your same God, breeds idolatry. And he says this because you're a holy people. To the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples of the earth. The Lord didn't set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more numerable than other people. You were the least of all people. But because he loves you. And he would keep the oath that he swore to his fathers. And then he says this side note, and it's an important one. Mark down Deuteronomy 7:22. Please hear me and let this bring comfort. God says, when you enter the promised land, I'm not going to give you all the land at once. Because there's not enough of you to fill it. You're not fruitful enough yet. I'll give it to you part by part. Because if I give it to you all now, you won't actually occupy all of it. And the beasts of the field will actually become too numerous because, in other words, there'll be squatters because the land will be vacant. So you accepted Jesus. Now you're a year into it, and you're like, why am I still struggling? Shouldn't I be perfect by now? If so, you're way ahead of me. And you're way ahead of Paul. He says, look, I'm going to give you the land part by part. Here's the good news. Each part I give will be as you become more and more fruitful. And as you become more and more fruitful, you'll actually appreciate all of the land and actually occupy it as I give it to you. If God delivered you of everything the moment you said yes to him, most of the stuff would never have made your inventory when you thank him. But if God actually allows it to be part by part, you'll always have some reason to tell me how God is the God of your life today, not just the day you said yes to him, for what it's worth. Deuteronomy 8 takes us back to the wilderness. He goes, I just want to remind you, he humbled you, allowed you to hunger, fed you with manna. You didn't know in the world that was, but that he could let you know this simple thing. Man does not live by bread alone. Does that sound familiar? But man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Chapter 9, I want to warn you, when you get there, do not say it's because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in to possess the land. It's actually because of the wickedness of the nations. And that's like people, and it's like, pardon me for using this very lame comparison, but people say, why did America vote for Trump? And I'd say, I don't think most people have voted for Trump. I think they just voted against Hillary. And the idea is you kind of had two different people to choose. I actually think, I'd like to introduce this idea. I think it would work here as well. And that is an anti-vote. It's just my own weird idea. But the idea is that you can't in good conscience vote for either, but you can actually vote against one more than the other. And the idea is, maybe I can't vote for either, but let's take a vote away from this one instead. That's the idea of an anti-vote. Anyways, I kind of like it. But he's like, look at, in the end of it all, and he's like, look at, you were not righteous. They were just horribly wicked. And he says, the Lord is driving out from you. And he goes, by the way, do not forget about the cow incident. Where you were dancing around naked before a gold thing, and Moses came down and his brother said, I don't know, we threw gold into the fire and out came this cow. God's like, this is a moment we're going to be playing over and over and over. You should see them laugh and cry at the same time in heaven over this one. You are a stiff-necked people. But would you please remember this? Please hear me. Don't forget about the serpent. Remember the one that actually, in Numbers 21, was raised up, but then you made an idol out of it? Or the gold cow in Exodus 34. You have an affinity for idolatry. So be aware of your blind sides. Listen to this, please. When God inserts you in to change the world, please be aware of your blind sides. Because there are things, and all a blind side is something that you don't guard that you should, that could take you by surprise. In American football, and I think this happens in European football as well, it is really wise to have guys that are there to block for you or to guard for the person that comes in a place where you can't see them. In American football, it's paramount. It's essential. Because what happens is you're running with the ball, and the one guy that's the most dangerous is the guy that comes from your blind side. He comes from where you can't see him, because not only does he clobber you, but he usually goes to rip the ball out of your hands, and it's pretty tragic in a whole lot of ways. And then you're laying on the floor for the next half hour wishing death upon yourself. And it's like your real friends are blockers. They're actually not just the one that's going to go, I want to warn you, but they'll actually seek to get in the way of that person or that thing. Hey, that thing could be romance, which clearly seems to be the case, or idolatry. What is the thing you make an idol out of? Is it money? Is it success? Is it fame? Is it importance? Is it being cute to the rest of the world? Whatever that thing is, have somebody that loves you enough to guard your blind side, because chances are you will do a great job of lying to yourself about that thing. But let's be honest, if someone's going to guard your blind side, it's only proper to do it in return. Finally, chapters 10 and 11 to close this portion up, and the rest moves rather quickly because it's 5 quick sections. If you receive this love, even when you were a stranger, return the favor. Chapter 10, what does the Lord God require of you? Fear the Lord, walk in his ways, and to love him. Because the Lord delighted only in your fathers to love them. He administers justice to the fatherless and widows, loves the stranger. Therefore, love the stranger. Kind of get the theme here, don't you? So how does he end this section? Beloved, I said before you, behold, I said before you a blessing and a curse. The conclusion, your faithfulness is not required for God to love you, but your prosperity, your joy, and peace are. What I learned from my past is faith will lead to obedience, which will lead to blessing. Without it will lead to disobedience, which leads to idolatry, which leads to destruction. The problem is I'm prone to wander, but the comfort is that he's faithful anyways. So, I said before you a blessing and a curse, the review of their unfaithfulness, yet it's a review of his faithfulness. And he ends it by saying, listen, Put the blessings on Mount Gerizim and put the curses on Mount Ebal. Note that because it's going to come in handy here for a second. But he simply ends it with this. I'm giving you a choice, guys. Now you know what you're prone to, but I'm setting this before you as a choice. Blessing or curses, you can choose them. You'd say, well, that doesn't sound very fair. Why doesn't God just allow us to be blessed even in our disobedience? Why would anyone that loves you do that? Why would I want my kids to hate me and go, let me just bless you in every way so you'll never come back? Second section. Are we all there? Take a big... Good job. Let's look ahead. Now that we have a review of our past, in the simplest sense, we're prone to wander. God isn't. Thank the Lord for that. So guard your blind sides. Remember, in faith, you follow him and you take down giants. Without faith, you find yourself bowing to a stupid dead thing. And it gets you nowhere but destruction. Now let's look ahead. Listen, be different so you can be the difference. It's that simple. And there'll be 5 things, and I have them down here. Singularity, these are things that we should be different in. Singularity, society, significance, sentiment, and standard. Do you see those at a glance? Chapters 12 through 14, singularity. Chapter 12, when entering the next country, destroy everything. Here's the point. God has a specific way he wants you to worship him. And he doesn't want you skimming off of any of theirs. He wants to put us in a heavenly encounter where it feels like heaven, not drag us into the worldly nastiness like burning children. 43 times in the books of the Kings and Chronicles, God talks about people worshiping on high places, though he clearly says that's not acceptable. So when you walk into the world, God places you to change. Stop looking what you can take from it, but rather look for opportunities to be a world changer. Chapter 13, false prophets. There are 2 basic checks. Here's the first of them. If they say, let us go after other gods. He doesn't say if they fake a miracle. He says if they do a miracle. If they do a miracle or a sign or a wonder, and you are blown away, but then they say, let's go after another god. You know what the result is? Stone them. And you've probably heard it said, you know why there's so many false prophets in the world today? We stopped stoning them. This is why in Acts chapter 4, verse 7, after Peter and John raised that lame man from the Gate Beautiful, they ask, by what name or power have you raised this man? They're trying to get chapter 13 against them. Because if they're like, well, if they say anyone but God, they're saying, let's go after another god, we can stone him. They don't bow to that, by the way. Hey, look at, if it's your most intimate family member, it still happens. If it's a whole city that does that, the whole city gets burned. Even their stuff. God takes this very seriously. Because this is all about departing from God. He goes, look at, this shows that you really love me with all your heart and your soul. And hear me on this. What God shows, one of the ways we show God our love for him is what we're not willing to tolerate. Did you find that interesting? Well, let's be honest. I'm going to use Mick and Lessica for an example. Let's say there's a couple, Mick and Lessica. And let's say that for whatever reason, Lessica had entered a beauty pageant and she won, and there were 3 people that she beat out. One from Argentina, one from Zimbabwe, and one from, give me another country. Quick. Jamaica. Okay. Zimbabwe, Jamaica, and Argentina. And they want her dead. They are so angry because they genuinely thought they deserved the pageant, and they were very upset about the whole thing. So they want to come over. So one of the ways that they can actually try to make Lessica's life more miserable is to try to buddy up with Mick. If they can really buddy up with Mick, they know that's going to really hurt Lessica. Let's be honest. Now, Mick is no dummy. He's well aware of their intent. But he has 2 options. I mean, one of them is he could walk around with them. After all, they're still beauty pageant girls, and he's looking like entourage here. But he knows that's really going to hurt Lessica. But if he doesn't tolerate it, it would be clearly understood by Lessica that he cares more for her. Does that make sense? It's a simple illustration, but it makes sense. Now God says, somebody that's saying, come on, let's go after, let's face it, if Mick had a couple friends that really fancied going cruising and hunting down the girls, and that's all they were ever really into, I would feeling Lessica would probably find problem with that. And if he was like, yeah, dude, I'm just going to hang out with the guys, have a couple beers, hang out at, those clubs where coincidentally not everyone's clothed. She's like, wait a minute, where are you going? And he's like, well, yeah, no, just my buddies. His tolerance of that hampers their relationship. So when someone says, come on, let's go after other gods, isn't that sound the same thing to God? He goes, really? I'm not trying to be uncool, God's speaking about the fact that you not tolerating somebody trying to get you away from me really does show where your heart is with me. Chapter 14, by the way, don't cut the front of your head or shave the front of your head cut any part of you, or shave the front of your head for the dead. By the way, that is the birth of peyotes, if some of you are familiar with it. Some of you have seen the Orthodox men and they have those curly things in the front. Comes from this chapter. Because the idea of it is, we don't want to shave the front of our head, so we're going to overdo it so you can kind of see. Now you can get like Lee press on peyotes just to make sure you can see so they wag and you. But it's like, you get the idea. Tithe your grain, but by the way, interesting for chapter 14, when you look at tithes, interesting, you bring your grain or whatever it is, interesting enough, you eat it yourself. You bring it to God and you eat it with him. How is that? God's like, do this with me, would you? Except the third year. You leave it for the needy and the Levite. So our first section in regards to that was in regards to singularity. Now hear me on this. Simple idea of it is one God, one relationship. In other words, we don't play the spiritual field. How's that? Second one, society, chapters 15 through 18. Chapter 15, every seventh year, you release slaves, you release the people who are in debt, and you have voluntary bondservants. By the way, do you know why a bondservant becomes a bondservant? What's the theme in this book?
No.
Deuteronomy 15:26. But if he says that he loves him and his household, do you know what he does? He goes to the master's doorpost. He drives an awl through it, which is just through his left ear. And then he puts a ring in it. Do you know that all my years of playing rock with long hair and all of that stuff when I was younger, never had my ear pierced? I became a Christian. I read this, and I'm not telling you you have to do it. It was just me. That's why I have this. I've had it ever since. Because and the idea of it is voluntary service for the rest of your life because I love my master and I love his family. Listen, I don't just love my master. I love his family too. For Paul to say he was a bondservant was more than him just saying he loved his master. He loved his master's family too. What separates us from the rest of the world is how we handle those indebted to us and whether or not service is a good or a bad thing. Let's face it, service in the eyes of the world is a very bad thing. But we gladly surrender. Next, those two Hebrew words is the shalosh regalim, actually, shalosh regalim, and that is the three feasts. Chapter 17 has two key points. Whoever is deserving of death shall be put to death at the testimony of 2 or more witnesses. So 2 plus witnesses. And then the requirements for a king. He doesn't say if you ask for a king, he says you will. But when you do, he must be Jewish. He must not multiply horses or wives or bling bling, silver, gold. But he must write a copy of this law and read it every day, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. Listen to that. Listen, you know what separates us in our society? Is we are a society of forgiveness. Isn't that what happens every 7th year? We are a society of service. We don't hold on to it forever. No bitterness. And we feast. I have a friend that says, you party to forget, but you celebrate to remember. We feast to remember. The world parties to forget. And finally on that, our leaders are servants. Isn't that what it tells us in regards to kings? That his heart may not be lifted above his brethren. Mark 11:42. The Gentiles of the world lord over, but let it not be so among you. Whoever wants to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven, let him be your servant. Chapter 18, the Lord will raise up a prophet like me from among your midst. And of course, that speaks of Jesus, the delivering prophet. And that tells us our second prophet test. Remember the first one? What was the first test for a false prophet to prove him false?
Miracle?
And when he does the miracle, what does he do? Or what, more specifically, what does he say?
By whose name?
Let's go after other gods. Remember that? The second one, chapter 18, if a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the thing doesn't come to pass. It's rough to be a prophet. According to Scripture, you have to be 100% right 100% of the time or they stone you. There are people out there today hired in churches as resident prophets. Spoken to a few of them. And I ask them those dangerous questions like, let me just ask you something. You ever have those moments you're just kind of not feeling it? If someone comes up to you for a prophecy and you just make something up and you just know it really wasn't the Lord, you're just making it up? I am sickened how many times someone's like, yeah, of course. And I'm like, you do realize you should get killed for that, right? Well, there you go. What separates us is we're just not buying everything. But by the way, a guy that's going out with a girl but still checking his options, something needs to change. Third section, significance. Chapter 19 are cities of refuge. If you keep the commandments that you do as I command to love the Lord your God, I'm going to give you more land, and with more land you need more. Why do you need more cities of refuge when you get more land? Because I don't want it to be too far for anyone to get to. So if you grow a whole lot of land, imagine if you will, it's sort of like this. Let's say that the UK was just England. The guy goes, if you obey me, I'll give you Ireland. If you obey me, I'll give you Scotland. And heck, while we're at it, just for good measure, I'll toss in Wales too. He's like, but if I give you Scotland, guess what? You need a city of refuge in Scotland or two. If I'm going to give you Ireland, it'd be good to give you two cities of refuge, one in the north and one in the south, just in case they can't get along. And Wales, while we're at it, let's put one there as well. Do you see the point? And here's the thing. What God holds, what separates us from the rest of the world is mercy. This is a guy who unintentionally kills someone, and he's not going to get killed for it. And then chapter 20, listen to this. The priest says, the Lord is going to go before you to fight against your enemies. That's the priest's job. As he starts by going, you need to know who's fighting this battle. And then he says this. Anyone have a new house? Anyone have a new vineyard? Anyone have a new bride? Or any of y'all that just afraid? Go home. How's that? Now, if you were afraid, would you just say, bought a house? Did that look like you were afraid? Just got married. That's your sister. No, it's not. Just looks like her. The army, listen, remember what we've seen already are the dangers of lack of faith. And what he knows is fear is contagious. Look at when you're going to go to battle and move forward with the Lord, you need people who trust God with you. Because the sad thing is it only takes one guy in an army to freak out, to kill the whole platoon if you're not careful. And God says, I really don't want that. He goes, you know what? Just stay home then. Hey, you have those days where it's like, we're going to go out street evangelize. Let's be honest, that's a battle. It's a battle to get over whatever in our own hearts first. To be honest, that's really the biggest battle. And you're like, I'm so amped to go. And 15 people say, yeah, I'm so into it, until the day comes. And then they're like, suddenly feel sick. I didn't feel sick. Or whatever. It's like amazing. And it's like, and you want to talk them into it. Oh, come on, man, it'll be great. There's victory to be had. And so forth. And God goes, you know what? If they're fearful, just let them stay home. You can challenge them. Hey, don't do it. Just come with me and don't say anything. Just watch. But in the end of it all, here's the idea. If we're going to go to battle, he wants wholehearted battlers. He wants you in with all your heart. Because if you're in with half your heart, dude, you're just going to go down, and God knows it. Chapter 21, he says this, If, there's a city and there's a city in between, there's a dead guy, and they look and they're like, well, we're not shooting, not my dead guy. It was not my dead guy. You measure to see which city is closest to. And the city is closest to, of course, is responsible to make sure that person gets a dignified burial. In my mind, my first thought is, maybe because I come from conspiracy theory kind of a headset, is the one that it's farthest from is likely the one that did it, because they're like, well, obviously we need him closer to another city, so we're not responsible. Anyways, the whole point is this: treat even a dead person with dignity. And then finally, in chapter 22, return lost things if you're able. Like for instance, you see a cow and you don't know whose it is. Well, you don't know, you're not going to walk around with it. You hold on to it, but you let people know, I found a cow.
So it isn't finders keepers.
There's no finders keepers. That's right. As a matter of fact, let me tell you how far it gets about making sure you're taking care of other people's things. You know what the chapter ended with? Adultery is a capital offense. See how those two things come together? Sorry, that ain't my wife. And I ain't going to hold her until the right guy shows up. In other words, listen. Significance. We value life. That separates us from the world. When you go into this world to change it, show them that you value life. You protect the unintended and the innocent. Your battle is only for the all-in. And even other people's things are important to you. Y'all with me? Because we're almost closed here. I'm having fun. I'm sure that shocks you. All right, here we go. Sentiment. Chapters 23 through 26. Can I remind you about Balachim? Remember that whole dumb situation? Remember how he tried to curse you and tried to curse you and tried to curse you? It never happened. You know why? Because you're important to me. This is what it says. But the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God, want to guess what the word is there? He loves you. Interesting. You know what he said at the end of that chapter? I find this interesting. He put this in the same place. Bury your poop outside the camp. Because you were important. Now let's face it. You get the idea. I don't want to develop it too much. You don't need to. But the idea is, we all know now things that people didn't then, which is like all kinds of diseases and horrible, nasty things. This is waste for a reason, and we call it waste for a reason. Don't let it be in the center of your camp. And you can imagine, if God doesn't want that waste in the center of your camp, he doesn't want spiritual waste in the center of your camp either. And then listen to this, chapter 24. When you get married, how does this sound, guys? You get a year off of war and of business to bring happiness to your wife. He goes, once you get your bride, tell me if this sounds familiar. Once you get your bride, once you get the one you love, take some time off. Does that sound familiar? How about Genesis chapter 2? Once, or for that matter, we can go Genesis 1 for that. Once you get the one you love, take some time off. What did God do? How does that work with God? We call that the Sabbath. And he goes, I did this because I want to bring happiness to my wife. That's the idea. Today we booked that down to a couple weeks. We call it a honeymoon. Same idea though. And then here's a fun term. Ready? Say this with me. Bit. Thank you. Now let's all try. Bit. Chalutz. Hana'al. Bet chalutz hana'al. You know what it means? The guy with the forfeited sandal. Yeah, what's the story? Hey, your brother gets married, but they don't have any children to carry on the family name, and he dies. You actually have to marry his wife to have a baby and name it after your brother, so that family doesn't end. Which, by the way, would lead me to believe if you were the younger brother, you should have a lot of say in who your brother marries. But what if you don't want to? What if you'd be like, I wouldn't have married her. I told him not to marry her. Well, he can actually say, I don't want to marry her. And what happens is he's take off his sandal and she spits in his face. And then they call it the house of the sandal, the house of the removed sandal. Bet chalut chana'a. There it is. How's that? And by the way, we pay Amalek because they did attack the weak and the stragglers back in the valley of Rephaim. I didn't forget about that. That's what God says. Chapter 26. Today I proclaim to you, the Lord be your God, that you walk in all of his ways and his statutes, his commandments, and his judgments. Obey his voice. Also today the Lord has proclaimed to you to be a special people, just as he promised that you keep his commandments. This, the simplest part is, it's all about what is God's sentiment in all of this? Simple. God loves you and he wants the inside of you pure. And he is committed. Thank God for that. I might say this too, what separates us, should separate us from the rest of the world, is our marriages, our families. Wouldn't that be nice? Finally, chapters 27 to 30, and then the rest of it's just final words. Chapter 7, I want you to collect the blessings, collect the curses, and write them on whitewashed stones. And then I want you to build an altar. And I want you to put that altar at Mount Ebal. Why is that important? Does anyone remember those two mountains? Yes, excellent. It is the mount of curse, not the mount of blessing. Remember what an altar is. That's where you meet God. You meet God at the sacrifice. God is going to meet you at the hill of the curse. Does that sound familiar? Might I say this? Deuteronomy 21:23 says, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. God became a curse for us. And that's where he meets us. And by the way, it doesn't even say at the top, but at the bottom. God has to come down, not man rises up. God meets you at the bottom of your curse. Oh, glory to God for that. Chapter 28, the blessings of obedience, the curses of disobedience. You follow me, you'll be blessed, you'll be blessed, you'll be blessed. It'll be everything from prosperity, and I mean that in the sense that God's going to bless you with the great joy and the sustenances you need. But if you want to bail from him, don't expect that. Expect the very things that God would do to protect and provide for you to be removed. It's that simple. Chapter 29, God provided in unusual ways. He's not limited to your mind. Aren't you thankful? Have you ever said, God, this is the way this has to work out? And then God says, no, that's not it at all. I'll give you a raise, or he'll do something weird on you. And you're like, that was not one of my options. One of the funniest things to do is to give God 3 options and watch him come up with the letter D. He defeated giants to give 2.5 tribes their land. So obey now and get yours. And then he says in chapter 30, see, I've set before you today life and good, death and evil. I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, and I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. Therefore, cursing, and therefore choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God. Did you notice both sections basically end with the same thing? He goes, let's review your past. Now make a choice. Blessing or curses. Now let's look at the future. Now let's make a choice. Blessing or curses. Chapter 31, Moses says to Israel, be strong and of good courage. Then he turns to Joshua and he says, be strong and of good courage. And then God says, write down this song. And as you write down this song, sing it to the people. Remember what Moses' objection to God was? He was slow of speech, or so he says. Though he does write the first worship song we have in Scripture, by the way, for what it's worth, Exodus chapter 15. So then there's this song. And here's the idea. When the people go whoring, when the people commit adultery, when they get lame and they get all beat up, this is a song to sing, and it is 43 verses long. And it's not, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. It basically presents God as our Father. It presents the people as rebellious. And it presents the Gentiles as beneficiaries. Does that sound familiar? That's the whole book of Romans, chapters 9 through 11 right there. Chapter 33, God blesses the tribes. He says this in Deuteronomy 33:3. Yes, he loves his people, and his people receive his word. Everyone receives his word, he says there. And then finally in chapter 34, Moses dies. Joshua assumes leadership. And then it says, but since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. Listen, in its simplest sense, this should look different. If you're going to be a world changer, here it is in the simplest sense. It's like God wants you to take a look at your past and go, do we not have a history of slaying giants up to this point? Why are you afraid to move forward? Can I say that again? I feel so compelled to say this. Do we not have a history of slaying giants together? Why are you so afraid to step forward? And when you do, be single-minded. Single-minded with one God. Let your society be one of forgiveness. Let every human life be significant to you. Let every human life be important to you. And remember, I don't meet you at the top, I meet you at the bottom, and I walk with you. That will make us different because everyone else is trying to earn what you've been given out of love. Let people know about that. And let your family, your marriage, your relationships, let that be what's important. Because that's going to be very different from the world around you. And I want to warn you, each one of these things is a blind side. Some of us have several blind sides. If all of them are blind sides, we're running around with our eyes closed, then that doesn't sound good at all. But wouldn't it be great if we took God's advice today? Tonight, my challenge to you, when you lay your head on the pillow, two things. One, hey, God, remind us of a couple of these giants. Just remind me again. Some of you have heard the story. Nick's heard it more than once. About saying, Lord, when you've called us to follow you out of London, and we were going to talk to our oldest, this will be a part of my testimony for the rest of my life of what you're going to do with that. That is undoubtedly a giant slaying. Undoubtedly. The church has agreed to help us with some of this substantially. That's another giant. There are other giants we're looking at here. But to be honest, 9 years ago, the giant was seeing you guys in a room like this, studying the Word and hungry for His Word. You realize, could you have imagined 9 years ago you would be going through the book of Deuteronomy in a night and think, yes. Some of you are like, yeah, maybe. Some of you are like, I wasn't even saved then. I wouldn't have known what Deuteronomy is. It means the second law, by the way, because it's the second time it gets done. And I just want to pray. Two things, remember. That's the first is, Lord, remind me of some of those giants. Let me, if you can remind me a date, let me make those celebrations. Then secondly, how, Lord, do I love you with my heart, soul, and strength? My heart, my drives, my appetites, what I think and what I dream, and with the physical body you've given me, how do I love you with that? What does tomorrow look like? How do I practice? When we talk about love languages, it's interesting. No one ever thinks, how do I show those to God? You even don't even think, God, how do you show those to me? Usually the only way that we apply that is to see how somebody else is talking to us that way. It's like, Lord, how do I love you in ways you interpret love? You know what he'll say, by the way? Love that other person. Because he goes, and let me just say this to close with that. Ruthie will never be, and we've said this with both of our children, will never be most comfortable with our love by the way we treat them. Not that we treat them poorly. They'll be most confident in our love by the way they watch Suzanne and I treat each other, because they're able to observe that. And because of that, they're able to be sentinelic enough, pulled aside enough to watch that and go, that's the way they interpret love, and they're able to watch it. And might I say, the world wants to see how we love God. I think they'll do the same. Well, let's pray.